This is Rock and Roll English. Real people, real English. Here's your host, Martin Johnston.
Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of Rock and Roll English. Episode number... I actually don't know, I didn't look before, but we are in the 50s somewhere, mid-50s I think. Anyway, in today's show I speak to Dan the Man about, well, not a lot really, because I hadn't spoken to Dan in about a week, which is actually quite strange for us because we normally speak most days, but Dan was away on holiday without his phone, so obviously we didn't speak to each other. So we decided to do something a little bit different and just have a bit of a chat in this podcast, or you could call it a quick catch-up. So if you have a catch-up with someone, you basically meet and talk about everything that's happened since the last time you spoke to each other. Very simple. And that's exactly what we do. We talk about general things, like friends do. We talk about some plans for the podcast, as we often do. And as I said, it's just a normal conversation. But there is still some rock and roll vocabulary, of course. So remember to go to the website, rockandrollenglish.com, and you can find all the vocabulary there with a quiz to help you remember. And we also speak about a video in the podcast, which you will not have seen yet. But don't worry, because we will release that tomorrow on Facebook. Anyway, have fun and happy listening. Dan the Man, how are you today?
I'm very good. How are you?
I'm very well. How was camping?
Yeah, it was good. I managed to burn myself.
What a surprise. We will talk about that in more detail in a minute. But before we do, even though this is a little bit different to normal shows, we are still going to start in the same way because routine is important, Dan. So how do we start these fantastic shows?
With a review.
That's exactly right. And do you think we have a review?
I'm going to say yes.
Correct. So this is from Alvaro03. As always, I apologise if my pronunciation is not correct. The title is Incredible Content and for Free. And it says, this podcast has become one of my favourite for learning English. It's incredible. Not only the podcasts themselves, but also the well-structured content available on the web and completed with additional quizzes and detailed explanations of the vocabulary that shows true hard work behind it. Lots of laughs with the conversation between Martin and Dan. Natural and enjoyable discussions with a healthy sense of humour. All of this for free. I think this couple, at least Martin, deserves much more recognition, and sincerely I think that a premium model of content, i.e. transcription, would be successfully accepted by many of the listeners. What a review that is. That is one of my favourite because he especially mentioned me as opposed to you, which is a type of review I like. So thank you, Alvaro03.
Yeah, it was very good. Again, we've been called a couple, which is alarming.
Yeah, just so everybody knows, Dan and I are friends, but we are not that good friends. Also, he has given me an idea about this premium model of content. Maybe one day, if I find the time, I will do that. So thank you very much. So let's get back to your camping trip, Dan. How was it?
Hang on, I have to warn you before we start this, because it's an impromptu conversation, I have got a cup of tea here. So if you hear me slurping, that's what that is.
Okay, very nice. Some rock and roll vocabulary there as well. Impromptu, which means without sort of preparation. And slurping. Can you make us a slurping noise, Dan?
With pleasure. Hang on.
Oh, that is fantastic. Thank you very much. So anyway, how was camping? How did you manage without a cup of tea?
It was quite hard, actually. That was one of the first things I did when I got back, was buy some milk. So yeah.
Wow. You really are a rock star, Dan. I saw the picture of you in that beautiful place, which I put on Facebook for the listeners. And I was going to say surprises me, but doesn't really surprise me, is that you are in such a beautiful place and you still look as miserable as ever.
What are you talking about? I was smiling.
You can have a look at that photo and believe me, you are not smiling. now we've got the listeners who can back me up. Nice little phrasal verb there. So who can support my argument because they can see as well and tell us, is Dan smiling in that photo? Yes or no?
But you don't want to smile too much on a photo. You just look weird.
Yeah, not too much, but a little bit, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, maybe. Well, I suppose compared to your recent acting performances.
Dan is referring to the video which you may have seen on Facebook or Instagram, which I made at work, titled Sunbathe. And there will be some more of these every week, Dan. Word of the week videos.
Well, you're in no danger of winning an Oscar.
Well, I disagree with you there. I think my acting skills are incredible. Although I have had many people send me messages saying, one, how ridiculous I look. And one person said, please put your belly away. So belly is stomach. So in the video, you can clearly see my stomach or my belly.
Yeah, why is that out?
Yeah, it's a good question. I didn't really notice at the time. I think it was because the choice was either take my shirt off because I was sunbathing or just like unbutton it a bit. And I chose the latter. So when I said that, I chose the second one of the two, the latter.
Why did you unbutton the bottom of the shirt?
Dan, I don't know, okay? I didn't know what to do. I was under pressure.
And why did the person behind the camera not tell you? Can you put your gut away, please?
Oh, nice. Gut is another word for stomach or belly. Probably because he wanted to fuck me over as well. So when you fuck someone over, you make them look stupid on purpose.
And you looked fucking stupid.
Thanks for the confirmation. But speaking of videos, good work, Dan, on creating the Rock and Roll English video, which has been incredibly successful. I don't know if anyone has noticed, but our likes on Facebook have increased from about 5 to nearly 2,000, thanks to Dan the Man creating this video, which I will actually share tomorrow, Dan, so everybody can see it.
Ah, that's the nicest thing you've ever said to me, Martin.
Well, that video is the first useful thing that you have actually done. So, it's a first for both of us, Dan.
Although you did get me to amend it about 40,000 times before I published it.
Amend, obviously, is change. Nice rock and roll vocabulary there. Well, Dan, I am a perfectionist, okay? So that is what I want. So I bumped into your sister, Dan, when I was at home.
Did you? Where?
Oh, yeah. So when I said I bumped into her, did I mean to see her, Dan?
Hopefully not.
No, obviously not. That's why I said bumped into her. I bumped into her in town.
Oh, yeah? Oh, God, what was said? She hasn't told me this either, so...
Well, that's probably because I'm not so interesting or important, so there was nothing really to talk about.
Did she know who you were?
I've known her, Dan, since she was about 4 years old. So, yes, she did recognise me. We had a good chat about you, actually.
Oh, yeah? Do I want to be talking to you about this on the podcast?
Dan, that's the point of this show. It's open to all the listeners, okay? We were talking about how you are such a free spirit now that you live in the south of France.
What? What did she say?
Just the same kind of thing, and how you're now vegetarian and you're like, peace, love.
I'm not actually a vegetarian, okay? I am going to eat meat again, I've decided.
Well, I mean, a week ago or 2 weeks ago, you said to me, I'm a vegetarian now. So What happened there?
Well, I'm a semi-vegetarian.
Is that a thing?
It is now.
I'm not really sure about that. So just really talked about that, how much of a dickhead you are. She's actually a lot funnier than you, Dan.
Oh, she's not. Clearly not. What, are you going to get her on the podcast?
Well, that's a good point. In fact, one other thing to bring up, which means to talk about, is that she told me you have banned her from listening to the podcast.
That's not true.
I said to her, have you listened to any? And she said, no, because Dan has banned me.
No, I said to her she can't openly comment on the stuff online because I don't want to be harassed by everyone I know back at home.
So nice word there again, harassed, which means like disturbed to get problems. But that is not the version of the story I heard, Dan. She told me very specifically that you have banned her. I mean, who do you think you are?
Firstly, my sister would never listen to what I said. If I said to her she couldn't listen to it, the first thing she would do is listen to it.
It's a nice second conditional there, Dan. Oh, rock and roll grammar. Keep going.
Well, that's it.
I was hoping we were building up to something big there.
You know my stories. They go nowhere.
A nice phrasal verb there again, to build up to something. You gradually increase the interest levels and then finally you say or do something big. In this situation, that is not what happened.
Mm-hmm. I wasted your time, essentially.
Exactly.
Anyway, enough about me. What have you been up to?
Rock and roll vocabulary again there, Dan. What have you been up to? What have you been doing recently? I have actually been trying, I must repeat the word trying, to learn how to cook.
Oh, yeah. Go on.
Because for I don't know how many years I have been cooking, well, I say cooking, like just surviving, really, eating enough food to survive. And I thought, well, I've got some free time, so I'm going to learn how to cook.
What have you been cooking?
Lots of stuff that I don't know how to name them. Lots of the food. I've got a recipe book in English. I don't even know what it means in English. And then I'm trying to go and buy it from the market in Italy. I don't even know what I'm buying.
Well, what was it in English?
Oh, many things. I've just realised how much of a complete idiot I am, basically.
Mm-hmm. I've been trying to tell you for a long time.
But yeah, now it's finally hitting home. So when something hits home, you finally realise it's true.
Are you doing this so you can cook for, a lady friend? Are you trying to find love?
That is not the case. But this is actually a problem. When you cook for one person, you make a lot of stuff and then obviously you have a lot of leftovers, so the extra food. Mm-hmm. And then I end up throwing it away.
Well, don't. Just eat it the next day.
Well, then I'm cooking something else, Dan. I'm always on the move.
Yeah.
Speaking of always being on the move, I've actually got a much more interesting guest than you coming on the show. Well, on Thursday, actually, because I'm going to do a special episode.
Okay, who?
Well, you don't know him. And I'm trying to create suspense here, Dan, for the listeners, okay? Don't ruin the surprise.
Okay.
Because what we're going to do now, Dan, remember, I am the leader of this podcast, so just to let you know, is continue with one podcast a week because it's killing me to do, well, it was killing me to do two. So, and then when we have special guests and people, that will be a bonus episode on a Thursday.
Sounds good. The less I have to talk to you, the easier my life will become.
Great. Well, I'm glad I've halved your workload.
Actually, speaking of my workload, are you going to share that video tomorrow?
Good point, Dan. I nearly forgot to say that. Yes, I am going to share that. And one thing that I would like to ask all rockers and rollers is if you could share Dan's work, that video, because one, it helps people to find us, and two, Dan has actually done something useful. So I think everybody should celebrate this.
Ah, there you go. One last dig.
And one last piece of rock and roll vocabulary there, Dan, a dig. So a dig is actually like a punch. And in this context, he's using it as a metaphor for an insult. And there is always time for digs, Dan. Mm-hmm. Always time for digs. Anyway, have a good week and probably speak to you sometime in the week.
Okay. Try to stop talking to my sister as well, okay? It's making me uncomfortable.
I will do my best, but I cannot promise anything.
All right, I'll speak to you later.
All right, see you later. Okay, so that was Dan and me having a quick catch-up. Remember, a catch-up is just a conversation where you speak about everything that's happened in your life since the last time you met or spoke with that person, which is exactly what we did. It can be a noun, like catch up, or it can also be a verb. You say, let's meet to catch up. Both work well. We had the word impromptu because Dan said this is an impromptu conversation. So that's obviously when you do not plan anything before. It's an adjective, so you always need a noun after it, like an impromptu podcast, impromptu speech, and impromptu something. And we had the word slurp because Dan was slurping on his tea, which was very nice. And we also had a very nice phrasal verb when I was saying that Dan was not smiling in the picture and he said he was. And I said, well, the listeners can back me up. They can support my argument. So please do that. Please back me up in this argument and mention on the post, well, if you think Dan was smiling or not. We also had the word latter when Dan was asking me why I had my stomach showing in the video. And I said the choice was to take off my shirt or unbutton it. So I chose the latter. So that's when you choose the second of the two things that you mention. If you choose the first one, you say the former, if you're interested. And we had the word gut, which is another word for stomach, when Dan asked me why the person making the video didn't tell me to put my gut away. It's usually used for people with a very large stomach. I don't really think I can say if I have a large stomach or not. So you can decide that if you want. But anyway, gut is large stomach. And a very nice, obviously informal term was when I said the cameraman wanted to fuck me over. So if you fuck someone over, you make them look stupid, you trick them. For example, a man in the market fucked me over today when I was buying some food and he gave me €2 change instead of 3 and I only noticed when I got home. So he fucked me over. Thank you. There was also the phrasal verb to bump into someone, because remember I bumped into Dan's sister, which is when you meet someone by chance, which is exactly what happened, Dan. Okay, I did not plan to meet her. I was walking down the street, she was walking down the street, and we saw each other, stopped and had a conversation. There was also the word harassed, when Dan said he didn't want to be harassed by people at home. So that's like disturbed. Normally famous people are harassed by normal people like me and probably you that ask for their autographs. But Dan isn't famous, so I don't know what he's worrying about getting harassed. We had the term to build up to something. So when you are building up to something, exactly like in the podcast when Dan was telling us something, you slowly increase the tension and then you do or say something big. Obviously Dan didn't do that, but that's generally what it means. Probably the most rock and roll piece of vocabulary was when Dan said, enough about me, what have you been up to? Which, just remember that term exactly as it is. It just means what have you been doing recently? We also had the term that I used when Dan said to me, I've always said you're an idiot. And I said, yeah, now it's finally hitting home. Like now I'm finally starting to realise it's true or accept it. Not very nice example of this is often when someone dies, members of the family, normally they're okay at the beginning, but later when they accept it, let's say, it then starts to hit home and then things aren't great. Sorry for giving you such a depressing example there. It's the only one I could think of. A more happy piece of vocabulary is the word leftovers, which is just the extra food that you have after you cook or you make dinner. There's sometimes a bit more, and they are called leftovers. And yeah, it's a happy piece of vocabulary because it's about food, and everybody loves food. We had the word dig as well, which remember is normally a punch. But in the context that Dan used it, it means an insult. Because at the end of the podcast, remember he said, time for one last dig because I insulted him again. Anyway, so I will release the video that Dan the Man has made about rock and roll English. And if you could share that, we would be extremely grateful. I actually think it's quite good. I'm still in shock that Dan the Man, 1, did something useful for the podcast, and 2, did it well. I know, it's incredible. And remember, all of the rock and roll vocabulary is on the website, rockandrollenglish.com. Go there, have fun, and see you on... Oh, actually, as I said in the podcast, I will see you on Thursday with a much more interesting guest, because, unfortunately, we will be staying on 1 podcast a week because it's just too much for me, 2 a week. Generally, from the start, to make a podcast, to do the research, record it with Dan, do the editing, do the website, takes me between 6 and 7 hours for each one. So 2 times a week, that's 14 hours plus a full-time job. So obviously it was very difficult for me. So what we're going to do now is always on a Monday with Dan, because that really is the heart of the show. Not Dan, like me and Dan speaking. And then there will be like bonus episodes on Thursdays every now and again. I hope that's all right. Please don't hate me. Have a good few days. Talk to you again on Thursday. And in the meantime, just keep on rocking, baby.
Thanks so much for listening to Rock and Roll English. For more great content and to stay up to date, visit rockandrollenglish.com and facebook.com/rockandrollenglish. We'll catch you next time.